The wedding invitation arrived on a Wednesday in March, cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering that made my hands shake as I read it. Harold Mitchell and Catherine Pemberton request the honor of your presence. I stared at those words until they blurred, then carefully placed the invitation on my kitchen counter next to a stack of unpaid bills and yesterday's newspaper. Harold was getting married to someone else, someone who apparently had the good sense not to call him a coward when he was already drowning in self-doubt. It had been 18 months since our relationship imploded, and I'd convinced myself I was over it. Over him, over the whole mess I'd made of what could have been something beautiful. But sitting there in my cramped apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of my air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic, I felt that familiar ache settle in my chest, like an old friend I'd been trying to avoid. The thing is, I hadn't meant to destroy us, I'd meant to save us. Harold and I met in 2019 at a community theater production of Our Town. I was there because my sister dragged me, claiming I needed to get out more after my divorce. Harold was there because he'd helped build the sets, volunteering his carpentry skills the way some people volunteer at soup kitchens, quietly, without fanfare, because it needed doing and he had the hands for it. During intermission, I watched him adjust a wobbly fence post that had been bothering him all evening. His movements were precise, economical, the way someone works when they truly understand their craft. When he caught me staring, he smiled with the kind of embarrassment that made my stomach flutter in a way I'd forgotten was possible. "Sorry," he said, wiping sawdust from his hands. "I can't help myself when something's not quite right." "Don't apologize," I told him. "I'm impressed. Most people would just ignore it." That was Harold in a nutshell, the man who couldn't ignore what needed fixing, whether it was a fence post or the leaky faucet in my bathroom or the way I'd get quiet when work stressed me out. He noticed things, cared about details, approached problems with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. We started slowly, coffee after the show closed, dinner at a little Italian place downtown, long walks through the park where he'd point out architectural details I'd never noticed, the way cornices caught shadows, how certain brick patterns had fallen out of fashion, why some buildings aged gracefully while others just looked tired. Harold worked for a construction company, managing projects that range from custom homes to commercial renovations. He'd started as a laborer right out of high school, worked his way up through sheer competence and reliability. No college degree, no fancy credentials, just steady hands and a mind that understood how things fit together. I was working as a marketing coordinator, the kind of job that sounded more impressive than it was. My days were filled with donor databases, event planning, and the constant low-level stress of trying to make limited resources stretch further than physics would allow. I'd gone to college, had the degree hanging on my wall, but Harold understood his work in a way that made me envious. "You get to build things," I told him one evening as we sat on his back porch, watching him sand a rocking chair he was refinishing. "There's something so satisfying about that." "Yeah, but you get to help people," he said, not looking up from his work. "What I do, it's nice, but it's not exactly changing the world." That was the thing about Harold. He had this way of diminishing himself, of assuming that whatever he was doing wasn't quite enough. It was endearing at first, that humility. Later, it would drive me crazy. For a while, though, we worked. He'd come over after long days covered in dust and paint, and I'd make dinner while he showered. We'd talk about everything and nothing, his latest project, my frustrations with grant applications, the books we were reading, the movies we wanted to see. He was funny in a quiet way, observant, thoughtful about things that mattered. I fell in love with his hands first. The way they moved when he explained something, scarred and calloused but gentle when he touched my face. Then I fell in love with his voice, the way it got softer when he was tired or thinking hard about something. Finally, I fell in love with his mind, the way he could look at a space and see not just what was there, but what could be there with the right touches. The problem started when Harold began talking about starting his own business. It was late 2020, and his company was struggling. The pandemic had killed several major projects, and Harold's boss was making noises about layoffs. Instead of panic, Harold felt something that looked like opportunity. "I've been thinking," he said one night as we cleaned dishes together, "maybe this is the push I need. I've got enough saved up to make it work for a while, and I know I could do good work, better work than what I'm doing now." I remember pausing with a soapy plate in my hands, looking at him carefully. He had that expression he got when he was working through a problem, focused, determined, but also slightly afraid. "That's exciting," I said, because it was. "What kind of business?" "Custom woodworking, mostly, maybe some small renovations. I've got the tools, the skills. I just need the guts to try." The guts. That phrase should have been a warning sign, but I was too caught up in the romance of it all. My boyfriend, the entrepreneur, building something from nothing with his talented hands. For months, Harold threw himself into planning. He researched business licenses, drew up project proposals, created a portfolio of his work. He was methodical about it, the way he was about everything, but I could see the fear underneath, the way he'd second-guess himself, revise and re-revise his business plan, find new reasons to delay the actual leap. I watched him transform his garage into a workshop, organizing tools with the same precision he brought to everything else. Each chisel had its place, each saw hung at the exact right angle, every piece of sandpaper sorted by grit. He'd spend hours out there, not working on paying projects, but perfecting his setup, as if having the perfect workspace would somehow guarantee success. "It's like watching someone build a shrine to their own potential," I told my sister over coffee one Saturday morning. "He's got everything he needs except the willingness to actually start." "Maybe he needs more time," she suggested, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. He's had time. He's had months. At some point, preparing becomes procrastinating. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely fair. Harold wasn't lazy or uncommitted. He was thorough, careful, the kind of person who read instruction manuals cover to cover before assembling furniture. In his regular job, this methodical approach was an asset. Contractors valued his attention to detail, his ability to spot problems before they became expensive mistakes. The issue was that entrepreneurship didn't wait for perfect preparation. It demanded leaps of faith, tolerance for uncertainty, willingness to fail and adjust and try again. All the things that made Harold excellent at his craft made him terrible at taking the first step into independence. I started noticing how he'd deflect conversations about his business timeline. When friends asked about his launch date, he'd pivot to technical details about his latest project or market research findings. When I suggested he reach out to potential clients, he'd suddenly remember another permit he needed to research or another aspect of his insurance coverage that required investigation. "I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything," he'd say whenever I pushed. "This is too important to rush." The rational part of me understood. Harold was risking his savings, his security, his professional reputation. But the frustrated part of me wanted to shake him and point out that he was also risking our relationship by letting fear masquerade as prudence. I began to resent the careful way he approached everything. The way he'd spend 20 minutes studying a restaurant menu before ordering. The way he'd research vacation destinations for weeks before booking a simple weekend trip. The way he'd read Amazon reviews for a full day before buying a $40 kitchen gadget. What I'd once found endearing, his thoughtfulness, his consideration, now felt like paralysis. "You can't research your way out of uncertainty," I told him one evening after he'd spent 3 hours comparing business insurance policies. "At some point, you have to make a decision and trust yourself to handle whatever comes next." "I know," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I just want to be smart about this." Smart. That was Harold's favorite word. His justification for endless delay. Being smart meant avoiding risk, planning for every contingency, never moving forward until success was guaranteed. But I was beginning to understand that the smartest thing he could do was accept that some risks were worth taking. The turning point came when Harold's coworker Marcus launched his own electrical contracting business. Marcus was younger, less experienced, more impulsive. He'd been talking about going independent for maybe 6 weeks before he actually did it. No elaborate business plan, no perfect workshop setup, just a truck full of tools and a willingness to learn as he went. Marcus quit today, Harold told me over dinner, his voice carefully neutral. Really? How do you feel about that? Good for him, I guess. He's got guts. There was that word again, guts, as if courage were something you either had or didn't, rather than something you could choose to access. You have guts too, I said. You just express them differently. But Harold shook his head. Marcus is out there getting customers while I'm still trying to figure out the perfect business card design. That's not guts. That's fear dressed up as planning. I tried to be supportive. I helped him design business cards, reviewed his contracts, celebrated when he finally registered his LLC. But as the months dragged on, and Harold found increasingly creative ways to avoid actually launching, my patience began to wear thin. You've been ready for 6 months, I told him one evening in early 2021. We were sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and half-empty coffee cups. What are you waiting for? I just want to make sure I've covered everything, he said, not meeting my eyes. This is a big step, Rosalind. If I mess this up, then you'll figure it out. That's what entrepreneurs do. Easy for you to say. You've got a steady job, benefits, a safety net. I'm looking at burning through my savings on a dream that might not work. I could hear the frustration in his voice, but I could also hear the fear. The same fear that had been holding him back for months, that made him brilliant at planning but terrible at executing. Harold, I said gently, you're never going to feel completely ready. Nobody does. At some point, you just have to jump. He nodded, but I could see him retreating into himself, building walls I couldn't breach. Harold had been talking about his business for almost a year, and he was still at the same construction company, still complaining about his boss, still making excuses about why this wasn't the right time to leave. I'd had a particularly brutal day at work. A major donor had pulled funding, leaving us scrambling to cover programs that helped feed families in our community. I came home exhausted and emotionally drained, only to find Harold on my couch, staring at his laptop with the same defeated expression he'd worn for weeks. Let me guess, I said, dropping my bag by the door. You found another reason to wait. He looked up, hurt flickering across his face. The market's still uncertain. Maybe I should wait until things stabilize. The market's always uncertain, Harold. There's always going to be something. A recession, a pandemic, a war, whatever. You can't wait for perfect conditions. I'm not waiting for perfect conditions, he said, his voice getting defensive. I'm being realistic. No, you're being afraid. The words hung between us like a challenge. Harold closed his laptop slowly, his jaw tight. I'm not afraid, he said. I'm being careful. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're so terrified of failing that you won't even try. You've been planning this business for a year, Harold. A year. At what point does being careful become being paralyzed? He stood up, pacing to the window. You don't understand. This isn't some game for me. This is my life, my future. If you fail, you'll be exactly where you are now. Working for someone else, complaining about it, dreaming about something different but too scared to reach for it. I knew I was being harsh, but months of watching him sabotage himself had worn away my patience. I loved him, but I couldn't stand watching him waste his potential on fear. Too scared? He turned to face me, and I saw anger flash in his eyes. You think this is about being scared? I think you're terrified of taking a risk, and you're hiding behind planning and research and market analysis, because it's easier than admitting you might not succeed. And what if I don't succeed? What if I lose everything I've worked for? What if I'm not as good as I think I am? Then you'll know, and you'll deal with it. But right now, you're not even giving yourself the chance to find out. Harold stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You know what? You're right. I am scared. But at least I'm honest about what I'm afraid of, Can you say the same? What's that supposed to mean? It means maybe you're so focused on pushing me off this cliff because you're afraid of your own stuff. When's the last time you took a real risk, Rosalind? When's the last time you put yourself out there for something that mattered? The question hit harder than I expected. This isn't about me, isn't it? You're so busy calling me a coward that you can't see you're just as stuck as I am. At least I'm admitting it. I'm not stuck. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to fix me. There's a difference. The fight that followed was ugly. We said things we couldn't take back. Accusations that revealed cracks in our foundation I hadn't known existed. Harold left that night, and we didn't speak for a week. When he finally called, his voice was quiet, careful. I've been thinking about what you said. Harold, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, you were right. About some of it anyway. I have been hiding behind planning. I am scared. I felt a rush of relief. We can work through this, together. I don't think we can, Rosalind. I think maybe we want different things. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you need someone who's already where you think they should be. Someone who doesn't need to be pushed or fixed or improved. And maybe I need someone who can love me while I figure my stuff out, not someone who's frustrated with me for not being brave enough fast enough. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but something in his voice stopped me, a certainty I'd never heard before. So what are you saying? I'm saying I think we should take a break, figure out what we really want. A break. The kind of break that everyone knows isn't really a break at all. Harold moved out of my life as carefully as he'd moved into it. He came by to collect his things when I wasn't home, left his key on the counter with a note thanking me for everything. I heard through mutual friends that he'd finally quit his job, that he was working on his business plan, that he seemed different somehow. I threw myself into work, convinced I'd dodged a bullet. Who needed a man who couldn't make decisions, who required constant encouragement just to live his own life? I deserved someone with drive, ambition, courage. But late at night, I'd remember the way Harold's hands looked when he was working on something he loved, the way he'd listen when I talked about my day, the way he'd made me feel like I was worth coming home to. I'd remember his question, when was the last time I'd taken a real risk? And I'd push the thought away. The wedding invitation changed everything. I stared at it for days, trying to process what it meant. Harold hadn't just figured out his business. He'd figured out his life. He'd found someone who could love him through his uncertainty. Someone who saw courage in his careful approach to the world. Catherine Pemberton. I looked her up online, hating myself for doing it, but unable to stop. She was a teacher, worked with special needs children, had a smile that reached her eyes in every photo. In one picture, she was standing next to a beautiful wooden bookshelf, and the caption read, "Harold built this for my classroom. My students love having a cozy reading corner." He'd built something for her, something beautiful and functional and exactly what she needed. 2 weeks before the wedding, I ran into Harold at the grocery store. He was in the produce section, carefully selecting apples, and he looked different, settled. There was a confidence in his movements I'd never seen before, a quiet assurance that made my chest tighten. "Rosalind," he said, his voice gentle. "Hi." "Hi." I felt suddenly self-conscious about my appearance, my cart full of frozen dinners and wine. "I got your invitation." I wasn't sure if I should send it, but Catherine thought, well, she thought you'd want to know, Catherine thought. Of course she did. Catherine probably thought lots of generous, mature things about ex-girlfriends and closure and moving forward. "I'm happy for you," I said, and meant it. "Really, you look good." "Thanks, I feel good. Different, I guess." "The business?" He smiled, and it was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "It's working, slowly, but it's working. Turns out I just needed to stop overthinking it and start doing it." "What changed?" He considered the question, weighing his words the way he used to weigh everything. "I met someone who saw courage in my caution instead of cowardice. Someone who understood that being careful isn't the same thing as being afraid." The words weren't meant to hurt, but they did. They hurt because they were true, and because they showed me exactly what I'd lost. "I'm glad," I said, and I was. "I'm glad you found what you needed. What about you? Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Was I happy? I was successful, independent, self-sufficient. I'd gotten a promotion at work, moved to a better apartment, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, but happy. "I'm figuring it out," I said. Harold nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "That's honest. I like that." We stood there for a moment, two people who'd once shared everything, now strangers making small talk over produce. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I'd been wrong about so many things, that I'd confused pushing with loving and fixing with supporting, but the words felt too little, too late. "I should go," I said finally. "Yeah, me too. Catherine's making dinner." Of course she was. Catherine, who built reading corners and made dinner and saw courage in careful men. "Harold," I called as he started to walk away. "Yeah, I never said this, but your work, what you do with your hands, creating things that last, it's not nothing, it's beautiful. I should have seen that," he smiled. And for a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with. "Thanks, Rosalind. That means a lot." I didn't go to the wedding. I couldn't. But I sent a gift. A beautiful wooden jewelry box I found at a craft fair, made by an artisan who understood the value of careful work. I included a note. "For Harold and Catherine. May you always see the courage in each other's caution." Months later, I found myself at another community theater production. This one a revival of Romeo and Juliet. I wasn't there for the play. I was there because I'd volunteered to help with costumes, spending evenings after work hand-sewing beads onto period dresses. It was slow, meticulous work that required patience and attention to detail. Work that couldn't be rushed or forced. That demanded I trust the process, even when I couldn't see the final result. Work that taught me the difference between being afraid and being careful. Sitting in the theater on opening night, watching actors I'd helped dress perform a story about love and loss and the courage it takes to be vulnerable, I finally understood what Harold had been trying to tell me. Courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, the willingness to build something slowly and carefully, one careful choice at a time. I thought about Harold and Catherine, probably sitting in their own theater somewhere, Harold's careful hands holding hers as they watched someone else's story unfold. I thought about the bookshelf he'd built for her classroom, the way he'd probably measured twice and cut once, the way he'd sanded it smooth and finished it with the same attention he brought to everything he loved. And I thought about the question he'd asked me that night we fought. When was the last time I'd taken a real risk? The answer, I realized, was sitting right in front of me. Every time I'd chosen to be vulnerable, to care about someone despite the possibility of loss, to try something new despite the chance of failure, that was risk. That was courage. The wedding invitation still sits on my refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a tiny hammer. Not because I'm holding on to the past, but because it reminds me of something important. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is love someone exactly as they are, fear and all. Sometimes courage looks like patience, like believing in someone even when they don't believe in themselves. I called my boyfriend a coward, and he found his courage in someone else's arms. But maybe, just maybe, I found mine in learning to forgive myself for not knowing how to love him when I had the chance. The theater lights dimmed, and the play began. I settled back in my seat, my hands still slightly sore from hours of careful sewing, and watched the story unfold. Around me, the audience grew quiet, ready to be moved by someone else's words about love and loss and the courage it takes to be human. Outside, the world continued its messy, complicated dance, but inside this theater, surrounded by costumes I'd helped create and stories that mattered, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace with my own careful heart, and the courage to let it love again.